Hi everyone, Ido here again with Tearfund's advocacy specialist, Morgan. Over the last 4 videos, we've taken a look at what modern slavery is, what it looks like around the world, what's being done, and today we're going to take a look at how modern slavery can enter into our daily lives through the things we buy, and then what steps we can take to make sure this happens as little as possible. So Morgan, obviously, like many other high-income nations, we spend at an insatiable rate, right? What's the impact of this on modern slavery?
Yeah, so many countries like New Zealand are high consumption nations. We drive kind of that ever increasing demand for things like clothing, food, electronics, entertainment. And when you combine this demand with the desire for our goods to be cheap and an increase, in the distance from where they're being made, well, it really just sets the scene for slavery.
So specifically, what are the links between that kind of increase in consumption through fast fashion and the likes and modern slavery?
Well, it's really quite simple. So we as the consumer want cheap products. So companies have to make their goods as cheaply as possible. And one of the major costs in the production of goods is the cost of labor. So by vastly reducing this cost through outsourcing labor to countries with, less strict employment laws, lower wages, it becomes profitable for a company to sell their products at a lower price.
So essentially their success is dependent on their exploitation of, the people and the loopholes, or government loopholes, in where their goods are manufactured. Is that kind of what you say?
That's exactly right, yeah.
Okay, so someone is paying for it, it's just not us, right?
They're paying the true cost.
Interesting. So what's an example of this in action?
Unfortunately, the fashion industry is rampant with modern slavery in the form of forced labor. And every single one of us wears clothes, so this applies to all of us. It's estimated that $128 billion worth of garments are produced using modern slavery and imported annually into the top 20 biggest economies.
So if you just, we just go back, you said it's through forced labor?
Yes.
So what does that look like?
Yeah, so the garment industry employs a lot of migrant workers and they can easily become trapped in forced labor, as we've talked about already, through the confiscation of their identity documents, such as their passports and their work visas. And this means that they're unable to find another job or sometimes even leave the country. And often people working in these forced labor conditions have restrictions on their movement. So it's not uncommon to have dormitories on the same site as a factory, for example. And both will be surrounded by high walls, which means workers may never be able to leave the complex.
And if I'm not mistaken, that's essentially what's currently happening with the Uyghur people and other Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang region in China, where there's a lot of cotton farms, right?
Yeah, so what's happening in China is a large-scale example of forced labor in the fashion industry. So these groups of people are being forced into re-education camps where they're both, indoctrinated and also forced to work. Upon finishing their work, they're required to sleep in dormitories surrounded by ironclad gates and just covered with security cameras.
So it looks like education, but it is actually kind of imprisonment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and this region produces more than 20% of the world's cotton. And thankfully though, many brands have begun to stop using the Xinjiang cotton, but unfortunately many companies still haven't traced their supply chains, so they actually don't know where their cotton's coming from. And this lack of knowledge is really what can be perpetuating the problem.
And I understand that there have been some recent reports indicating that these Uyghur people have been transported to other regions in China, many of which are connected to major global brands, to work in factories in those regions, right? So suddenly the risk of people's supply chains being caught up in this, this scandal, for the lack of a better term, is quite high.
Yeah, and it also means it's just a lot harder for brands and consumers to track whether or not the cotton in their t-shirt is coming from there. This example of forced labor is of course extreme and really large scale. However, it is really just one example of literally millions occurring in the broken fashion industry every single day.
What other industries would we find forced labor in?
Oh, so many. It's in the supply chains of many of the foods we love, particularly when it comes to fish, fruit, chocolate, sugar, and coffee.
Coffee?
Yeah.
Surely not.
Yeah, basically all of the best foods.
No.
Yeah, so if you take the chocolate industry, for example, more than 70% of the world's cocoa comes from Ghana and the Côte d'Ivoire. And there's an estimated 1.5 million children working in extremely hazardous jobs in these cocoa fields. And many of these children are victims of deception and trafficking. So it's really not uncommon for traffickers to find children at bus stops and offer them these brand new bikes if they agree to go with the trafficker. And then the child ends up in a cocoa field and is forced to work, and their parents may never see them again.
Damn, 1.5 million children, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's so sad. And I also know that in the fishing industry, there's a huge amount of forced labor. I remember, the first time I went to the field, with one of the members of the Tearfund team, they were telling me about, people on some boats having been on there for years without being able to get off, completely trapped in there. And I understand that we've had some instances of that in New Zealand waters, right? Can you share a little bit about the fishing industry and their forced labor?
Yeah, so there's a lot of forced labor in the fishing industry, especially in Southeast Asia, and in New Zealand. There's some as well. But yeah, the 24.9 million people trapped in forced labor globally. The International Labour Organization estimates that a substantial proportion of these people are trapped on board fishing vessels in the wider fish and seafood industry. So reports have suggested that fishers, many of whom are migrant workers, again, really vulnerable, are vulnerable to severe forms of human rights abuses, including physical violence, starvation, and even death by being just pushed overboard.
On the face value, it seems like it's all very distant and kind of far away, right? But then you start to look at it and you realize very quickly that it's actually much closer to home, and it's actually much more connected in the way that I live my life and the way that I spend my money or whatever, than what I would have originally thought, right? And I think for me that's quite shocking in that, and also there's quite a lot of hope associated with that, and that actually I have the power to change this what feels like an insurmountable problem, but also it's quite shocking in that I'm like, oh man, yeah, I've definitely bought some cheap t-shirts before, you know what I mean? And it's, yeah.
Yeah, and we think of the supply chain sort of ending when it gets to the shop, and then we go in and buy, but really we as the buyers are an integral sort of final product to that, or final piece of that supply chain. And we realize through that we're really actually not that far removed from, what happens earlier on.
Responsible in some way.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because in one of the earlier videos I talked with Dale about how there's some new regulation around the supply chain and some transparency around that. And it feels to me like, there have been many instances when I'm at a restaurant and I'm eating seafood, say for example, and I've got no idea where that's come from. Or I buy a t-shirt and I'm like, oh, what a score, it was only $20 or whatnot. And it's only in recent times I've actually become aware that, hey, I might be part of the problem here. I need to actually address the things I'm doing and not contribute through my daily life to this problem, right? It almost feels like it's impossible to do anything without a clear conscience. It feels like there's no real, easy way to go about it.
Yeah, so we live in a globalized world. We depend on imported goods, and that's okay. But really what we need to do is learn how to consume those goods ethically. And it's right to feel that, you sometimes feel like you can't buy anything, exactly as you said, without a clear conscience. But it really is possible. It just takes a little bit more effort. So we believe at Tearfund that we can respond to these challenges by becoming a more conscientious consumer. And can demand that the products, through things like the Modern Slavery Act, that we consume be produced more fairly and more ethically.
And I'd imagine anything is better than nothing. Right, so if I make a small step here, change the way I, buy a t-shirt, say, that's better than nothing, right? So everyone can do something, surely. But what are some steps that you would recommend of how we can become conscientious consumers?
Yeah, so first we just really need to stop and reflect on our consumption habits because, we've been conditioned into just buying more and more and more and more. Yeah, exactly. And by buying those super cheap, t-shirts or pants or whatever it is, we risk normalizing and creating demand for more goods made by these exploitative systems that we just discussed. So by throwing away goods, for example, more frequently than we need to, or donating them more frequently than we need to, we create this enormous waste which fuels industries that are, as we've talked about, denying workers their rights.
And of course, one of the reasons we seek out cheap products is because we're consuming too much, right? So I know in my own life, I kind of have to challenge that feeling of wanting more and that new thing and whatnot. And we've kind of found that my wife and I, we've been trying to purchase less but purchase more quality things, that kind of works two ways in that firstly you can't buy as much because they're more quality and actually cost the true value, but secondly they generally last longer or are better, and so we're not kind of caught on this hamster wheel, and are there some other ways that you would any other tips for us to shop more ethically?
Yeah, definitely. So first, when you're out shopping, if something seems impossibly cheap, it probably is. So somebody else has probably, paid the true cost of that item. Second, I would say avoid impulse purchases. So, too often we're out and we just buy things that we see, but we don't really necessarily love or even need. And then these items end up donated or binned after very little use. Yeah.
So kind of moving away from that, see now, buy now culture.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also just, a great way to save money as well.
Yeah. And let's be honest, it's often junk and we don't need it, right?
Yeah, and another way, to be a more ethical consumer is when you're out in the shops, you can look for certifications. So when you're clothes shopping, you can look for things like Better Cotton Initiative. You can look for things like organic or recycled cotton. And then when you're in the supermarket, you can look for certifications like Rainforest Alliance on chocolate, or trade aid products are great. Yeah, so there are ways, to be a more ethical consumer and to have more confidence in your purchase.
And what about op shopping?
Yeah, op shopping is a great option. So instead of buying new, buying secondhand goods doesn't contribute to that demand, which is always a good thing. And then when you're done with your clothes, it's a great thing to do to make sure to recycle them. Not a lot of people think of that, but it is an option. And then instead of just binning an item, you can learn to sew, which is great. So sewing up little holes. And then, when you do decide to go out and buy new items, which is also okay, researching what your favorite brand is doing to uphold worker rights in their supply chain, and writing to companies you love and asking them to, improve their policies, improve their ethical sourcing initiatives and things like that. And then, of course, familiarizing yourself with the Tearfund Ethical Fashion Guide is a way to get to know the high-performing brands that you can have a clear conscience about.
Those are great tips. And obviously there's a lot of companies trying to do work in this space, but what are ways we can urge the government to take action?
This is so crucial. So one way is you can write to your local MP about laws on labor trafficking. So the UK and Australia have established modern slavery acts, and New Zealand hasn't. So you can ask them, why haven't we?
From everything you've said today, it's become pretty clear that we can't try and combat human trafficking out there if we don't first take a look at our own lives, right?
It's the easiest and closest opportunity for us to curb the demand that leads to modern slavery and forced labor. So if someone, is outraged by forced labor but still supports the fast fashion industry by buying multiple cheap cotton t-shirts without really considering their origin or how the workers were treated, then what is their anger really worth? We have loads of opportunities to choose against supporting slavery in our everyday lives, but really it's up to us to put in that effort and to take those.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for the great tips. Essentially, it's going to cost us something, right? We've got to take action.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found that as challenging as I did. Next up, we're going to learn how we can talk to others to persuade them to care about modern slavery.